midwife for the National Health Service. I'm also doing a master's at City University, Global Maternal Health, and Feminist, obviously. I'm going to talk about a feminist analysis of the idea of risk in pregnancy and birth, and the risk discourse. I want to make it clear that what I'm talking about is not something like a clinical observation of something actually going wrong. I'm talking about theoretical risk when I talk about risk discourse. Obviously, in practice, if we see something, you know, as a midwife, if I see something that's actually going outside of the norm or a clinical problem, we act upon it. But this is more about how we, about the idea of risk of things that haven't happened. I think the risk discourse undermines women's autonomy, sees the woman as a vessel for the fetus, has a tendency to exaggerate the risk, creates anxiety in both women and healthcare providers, tends towards over-intervention to prevent theoretical risk, can cause more harm than it seeks to prevent. I think it's a mechanism of control and subordination, and I'm going to look at examples of pregnancy and birth, and then also how the risk discourse affects black and minority ethnic women and their outcomes. It sort of plays out slightly differently. Yes, so that's what we're going to go through. The risk discourse sees the woman's body as a faulty machine, as a ticking time bomb of things that might go wrong. So we're constantly scanning this machine for the malfunction that we're predicting to happen. However, health is not just the absence of disease, and the transition from pregnancy, birth, and into motherhood certainly isn't. If we take a salutogenic or social model of transition to motherhood, we see that woman transforming her social role, her emotional and spiritual self alongside with those physiological changes. In pregnancy, in the National Health Service, one of the things we do is a series of risk assessments, but whereby we give women a numerical score for their likelihood of developing preeclampsia, having a small baby, a big baby, a preterm baby, etc. Now, these aren't particularly good predictors, but nevertheless, I think they would form part of a good maternity service. However, there's two problems. One is, because of lack of time and the sort of pressures that we're working under, it's become almost all we do. So an antenatal appointment often sort of does that screening, and if it's, you know, if everything's fine, she's off, so there isn't much space for those other kind of supports. And the other problem is that those scores are often used as a justification for interventions. The other way it plays out in antenatal care is all the millions of do's and don'ts that we are given. Don't drink coffee, don't have even one glass of red wine, don't eat soft cheeses, even though you can hardly get unpasteurised cheeses. And in fact, in 2019, the rate of listeria in the population was 1 in 360,000. The reported rate of listeria was 1 in 360,000. That's compared to the chance of being struck by lightning at 1 in 300,000. So, you know, chemists are reluctant to give you any medication, be it for athlete's foot or flu or whatever, if it hasn't already been proven safe, whereas we don't really do clinical trials, so it's difficult. There's a woman in my clinic at the moment who needs a mouth x-ray for a root canal treatment. She's got bad toothache and she can't find a dentist to give her a mouth x-ray, even though the risk to the fetus is pretty much nil with a single mouth x-ray. Heterosexual sex, or sexual activity, by which they mean heterosexual sex, is interestingly enough not on the forbidden pleasures list. Sleeping on your left-hand side, that's another one, although that study actually wasn't a very good study and it hasn't been able to be repeated, but it's become very sort of prevalent, and women phone up, oh, I woke up on my back, what should I do, what should I do? And I think this whole sort of list serves to increase the anxiety in women. I think it comes from a sort of thought process that any risk to the fetus trumps any benefit to the mother, no matter how small the risk to the fetus is, or however large the benefit to the mother. The other side of it is seeing the woman's body in terms of its functionality. As Caroline Criado Perez showed us, the woman's body is not considered much in a world where the male body is the norm. That is, until it's pregnant, where it's assessed and valued for its reproductive functionality. Once you're gestating, possibly male fetus, suddenly the medical establishment becomes the expert on the pregnant woman's body. Doctors, relatives, passers-by feel that they can touch women's bodies without regard to the usual boundaries, and you become a recipient for a barrage of advice, wanted or not. And this advice is aimed at protecting the fetus at all costs, whereas the woman's body is to be kept pure. And I think this oppositional idea of the mother versus the fetus is a wrong way of looking at it. The fetus is inside the mother, is an integral part of her, and is dependent upon her body. So any idea of giving the fetus personhood is by definition, can't be compatible with the idea of the woman as an autonomous being, because anything you would enact for the fetus has to be enacted upon the woman's body. So the idea of any legal personhood makes no sense. I mean, in fact, in the UK, the fetus doesn't have any human rights in a legal sense, unlike the United States, which is a sort of another topic. But nevertheless, in the UK, in the last few years, we have had enforced caesarean sections. We've had women, court-ordered caesarean sections, where women are put under general anaesthetic by order of the court and had caesarean sections against their consent, and that's happened a number of times in the last few years. You've also got cases of, like Savita Halapanava in Ireland, who was refused the termination because of the patriarchal medical system there and died of sepsis, although that particular law has now been changed. Or Andrea in the United States, who died of appendicitis hours after presenting at the hospital because the hospital was reluctant to do a CT scan because she was 15 weeks pregnant. I was learning just last week in my course about women dying in road traffic accidents because they're not wearing their seatbelts because they're worried about putting the seatbelt across the bump. In the UK, we've got a lot of pregnant women in intensive care with COVID, and definitely in my clinic, you've got women refusing the COVID vaccination. Claire Murphy, the Chief Executive of the British Pregnancy Advisory Service, who we really like and is on our side, says, we have created a climate where women are expected to avoid any possible risk to their pregnancy, even in the absence of any good evidence of harm. The challenges we're seeing with the COVID-19 vaccine uptake are an inevitable consequence of this. I think this shroud waving, as we call it, or dead baby card, is unnecessary and coercive. So this is where they say, don't you want to do this for the safety of your baby, or this way, it doubles the risk of stillbirth. I think this is not helpful, and it's not woman-centred. I think what we do need is real statistics of absolute, not relative risk, and a chance to talk them through. An acknowledgement of women's own values and respect for the importance of that. And a community of women, pregnant women and birth keepers, to be able to see the transition from pregnancy, birth to motherhood in its social context. I'm just going to give a couple of examples to illustrate what I mean by these things. One negative, one positive, if you will, so two different sides of it. Sometimes in my clinic towards late pregnancy, I get to the point where I say, have you thought about your birth preferences, or what kind of, how do you picture your birth? And there's a number of women who sort of look slightly blankly and say, I don't know, whatever you recommend, whatever's safest. This is a massive thing that their bodies, some women, you'd feel they'd have more opinion on where they want to go out for a meal and then you at work, and they'd say, okay, well, what kind of things do you like? And we get there, but they have to be sort of led to almost think of their values. Then you get another situation. The statistics, right, so if you've got a woman who maybe has had a previous traumatic delivery or some other kind of sexual or trauma, she wants the home birth, she's post-date, so she's after her due date, she's being advised to go into hospital for induction of labour. And slightly raises the risk of stillbirth, if you're, say, after 42 weeks. She's thought about that, she understands the statistics, she's decided she'd rather stay at home and have her midwifery care there, because despite the fact that she's aware of those statistics, she feels for her she cannot bear the thought of going through an obstetric intervention list, what would be for her abusive situation again. That's her value system, she's made that decision. What can happen if women decline induction of labour, want to have a home birth outside of guidelines, decline growth scans, is you can get situations, not in all situations, but you can get a great amount of suspicion from the healthcare professionals, whereby social services or the mental health team or even the police are brought in to kind of question this, and I think that's not taking account of that woman's values. So moving on to birth. Right, the obstetric medical model is life-saving for the 10 to 15% of women that need it. In other parts of the world, that's really what we're fighting for, is safe, accessible, high-quality healthcare for those women that need it. However, most birth doesn't need that. So what you've got a situation where they've layered this medical model, which, like I say, is appropriate in some situations, but you've layered that in situations where it's not appropriate. We know that birth works best if undisturbed. If you liken it to, other sexual activity, which it is, it's using the same part of the body, the same hormones, much as you're unlikely to orgasm in a room with medical professionals poking you and taking your blood pressure and the lights on, you're in an interventionist birth isn't going to happen in the same way. The hormones aren't going to flow, the woman's not going to move in the right way, and birth is disturbed. Fear and anxiety are the enemy of a good birth. I think the discourse around home birth as well is often that it's kind of an experience for the mother but risky for the baby. So again, you see this kind of split of the mother and baby. However, massive studies, including the birthplace study, and that's been repeated in huge numbers all around the world, show that in a low-risk situation, home birth has lower intervention rates, lower rates of things like postpartum hemorrhage, better breastfeeding rates, less risk of infection for mother and baby, and greater what they call maternal satisfaction, which is one of the ways we kind of measure things. So if you've got a normal situation, then that medical model is not the safest. It's an imposition of an ideology. It is partly to do with the industrial model of birth, the fear of litigation, which leads to defensive practice, which leads to more intervention. I think we see that risk discourse. I've mentioned induction of labour, that's an intervention. I think actually going into the hospital is an intervention, because what you're saying is, you need to go there just in case something happens. But the act of walking through the hospital doors is the highest risk factor for caesarean section statistically. The other thing we do routinely that is a kind of screening for risk is the fetal monitoring, whereby you're listening to the fetal heart all through labour, with the idea that if something goes wrong, you would hear it in order to be able to intervene to prevent, for example, a stillbirth. In fact, the number of preventable intrapartum, so during labour, deaths is very tiny compared to the damage that I think these CTGs do. We know that it increases the risk of caesarean section and instrumental birth. We have what we call the cascade of intervention, whereby something like you go in for an induction, it's painful, so you have the epidural and you've got the CTG, you can't move around. Birth doesn't happen in the way that I was describing earlier. The heroic doctor comes in, does the forceps, does the episiotomy, saves the baby. The woman is left with physical and emotional damage. It is estimated that 1/3 of women have birth trauma. I think in practice, the number of women that come in and having had a negative birth experience, largely to do with the care that's given, is much higher than that. And I think this is partly due to the instinct of the medical establishment to intervene to control risk. A woman that's been empowered in her birth will feel confident to care for her newborn. A woman who's been told that she had failure to progress or an incompetent cervix and who was rescued by the heroic doctors may question her ability to care for her newborn. And I just love this picture, the way it's this kind of, she just seems so, I don't know, the centre of the thing and happy to introduce her baby. It just seems like a great start, really, for that family's life. So, avoiding risk is not the same thing as avoiding harm. I think the risk discourse doesn't see the woman as an autonomous decision maker, and it's infantilising us. Immortalising this phrase, am I allowed? We hear it all the time. With birth, women say to me, am I allowed to use the toilet? Am I allowed to eat and drink? Am I allowed to wear my own clothes?
just in their own births. I think we've got birth trauma from over-medicalised birth and obstetric violence, partly due to prophylactic interventions, so just-in-case interventions. We've got the fetus prioritised over the mental and physical effect of the mother. Women pay for this with a lot of guilt and blame. If you've been told, oh, don't do this, this is dangerous, this is what decisions, you know, for the safety of your baby, and then if something does go wrong, you know, the woman often carries that too heavily and inappropriately. And you've got women avoiding necessary healthcare, like, for example, the COVID vaccine. The last thing I want to talk about before concluding is the black and minority ethnic women question. So, at the moment in the UK, black women are 5 times more likely to die in situations of childbirth and pregnancy than their white sisters. It's a really shocking statistic, that. This group, we did invite them, but they couldn't come, but they have a lot more about it. You know, do go and have a look at their website, and I'm going to use some of their examples. What we see here is another example of the paternal kind of we know best attitude. But it's often black women saying, there's something wrong, I know there's something wrong, and not being listened to. Requesting interventions and having them denied. And their pain not being taken seriously. I'll come to that. So in obstetrics, we have this sort of dual problem, which we talk about a lot, of too much too soon and too little too late. A lot of what I've talked about is the too much too soon, but I think some of the problems in the black and minority ethnic outcomes are also to do with the too little too late. Not taking pain seriously. There's an example from that previous website of a woman called Cleo who presented with abdominal pain, was told it was constipation, told to go home, came back to A&E, was admitted to hospital, but 2 days went by before they did a scan which revealed internal bleeding from fibroids. Not being listened to. I myself at work have been present on the ward when a black woman told her midwife that she had diagnosis of epilepsy, wasn't believed. I've been present when a woman had prematurely broken her waters and they were casting suspicion on her. I mean, I can talk about this more, but just how it's so substandard care. As an example from the website, the 5 times more of Shamika, who there was a piece of placenta left inside after the birth, which does happen, but should be spotted. But it was 11 days postnatally that this was spotted, and when they looked over her care, she had not had the routine postnatal checks that everybody's supposed to have in their National Health Service. Luckily, she was okay. I think the last part of one of the reasons of these statistics is the hostile environment and the NHS charging policies. There is, some people are eligible to be charged, and it's a very complicated and obfuscating system, I think deliberately, which means that women don't know what they're entitled to. They find the whole thing quite overwhelming. I have been quite involved in this question. I find it really hard to know what women are entitled to and what their immigration status is, and you know, it's really complicated. So it's complicated, so it puts people off. They can't understand it. They're worried about the payment itself. They're worried that the Home Office is going to give, that the National Health Service is going to give their data to the Home Office. That doesn't actually happen anymore, but I think it has happened. But it's obviously a fear if there's some, you know, they don't want that. And there's language barriers, you know, because we're sort of often talking about recent immigrants here. So I think the patriarchy is evident in seeing birth as risky, seeing the mother's body and her reckless decision-making as risky. I think we see patriarchy evident in the paternal medical models of we know best, and that's represented both with the too much too soon and the too little too late. And seeing women as a pure vessel for whom all risk is to be avoided. What we need to do is reclaim our decision making, and that's also a kind of collective process, arm ourselves with real statistics and other qualitative based research, acknowledge and respect our own values, which includes the wish to not come out of birth feeling like you've had obstetric violence or an obstetric rape. As Milli says, a healthy baby is not all that matters, and remember that these are our own bodies.
heard, so I'm just going to yell at you if that is all right. Can you hear me at the back if I'm speaking like that? Lovely.
I've got the mic back if you want to.
No, I'm just going to go.
Okay.
My whole parenting experience has been waiting. Hi, so I am Charlie. I am a mother, I'm a doula, and I'm an academic. I'm writing an MA at York University at the moment. Like lots of women in my position, like lots of doulas and La Leche League practitioners, I became interested in birth once I started to have my own children. And it was once I started to have my own children that I started to understand the stories that we tell ourselves and each other about birth and how dissonant that is with the reality of birth. I wondered why this experience, which is so common, remains kind of scary, uncertain, unsure, intimidating, and often traumatic for people. So today I want to talk a little bit about knowledge and ignorance, and who owns that knowledge and who owns that ignorance, and what the implications are of that knowledge and ignorance in how much control we have and how much control we believe we have for mothers and midwives and medics. Women understand themselves to be ignorant about our reproductive bodies, and there's a good reason for that, because we often are. Like, we don't really understand how our bodies work and what processes we're going to be going through. But it's also because women's knowledge is prejudiced. Our knowledge is understood to be less credible, less meaningful, and less valuable than those kind of patriarchal, authoritative knowledge systems. Next slide, please. I thought it was probably worthwhile taking a moment to just think about what birth is, although Ziggy set this up really nicely for me, actually. All of our ideas and expectations about birth, like our ideas and expectations of everything, are mediated by what we see in popular culture, but for birth it's particularly, I guess, concentrated through the lens of medical risk as well. So women expect drama and crisis. In fact, I'm on call for a couple, not on call this weekend, I have somebody standing in for me, but I'm on call for a couple at the moment who are having their first baby, and we had a really long conversation the other day about how am I going to know when labour starts, and what are we going to do, and how quickly are we going to get to the hospital. And I had to introduce them to the notion that actually they may well be labouring for 24 hours or something before they even go anywhere, but they just don't have that understanding of how boring actually the early stages of labour can often be. So birth is not one thing. Like, birth is normal, but it is also unpredictable. It's a physiological process which we have evolved to do. It's the most appropriate way for adult human females to give birth, to produce their young. It can be medical, it can be surgical, but it's more than physical. It's liminal, it's transformative, it's precious, it's rare. Most women may not have more than one birth, or possibly commonly 2 births, but maybe 3 births. More than 3 is really unusual. So most people just are not connected with birth at all. It's a rare experience, and because of that, it's precious. It's also emotional, and for some people, deeply spiritual. It's a social event, right? Birth changes relationship dynamics, but it also changes wider families, and it changes whole communities. And in communities that are connected, lots of people get involved. It's multi-generational. It's also co-creation. Like, birth is a dynamic process. It is sensitive to environmental and contextual factors. And those environmental and contextual factors are both human and non-human. Like, the reason I'm a doula, the reason that doulas exist, is because we have an impact on the birth experience. But so does the clock on the wall in the room, right? So does the CTG machine in the corner. You know, every aspect of everything that a woman sees and feels and experiences in her pregnancy, in her birth, in the intrapartum period, can influence how that birth plays out. And birth can be experienced as good in a variety of different ways. We kind of have this narrative, this very kind of binary birth wars narrative, that good birth is, you know, spontaneous labour, no intervention, it's at home, it's the candles and the sandals and the burning sage, right? And bad birth is intervention and surgical assistance. But actually, women can experience what looks from the outside to be a traumatic event in a really positive way. And that's okay and normal too. But we need to get rid of this idea that, you know, birth is one thing. So there are all sorts of motivations and perspectives at play in any birth event. You know, birth is multi-axis, it's a confluence of all of these things and more, and we just cannot standardise it. So nothing I say today is about saying, this is the right way to do birth and this is how we should do it, right? That's not what I'm going to be saying at all. But knowledge about and therefore decisions about birth and how birth happens are overwhelmingly held by one group of people, and that is medics. Thanks so much. Now I can give any number of examples of how this plays out, but I'm technically only supposed to have 20 minutes, so I've only chosen two. And one of them is the due date. So having a 12-week scan is a modern right, R-I-T-E, of pregnancy. Like, the idea of talking about your pregnancy before you've had the 12-week scan is judged to be really unwise, because you shouldn't do that. You have to go in and you have to have your scan done, and you are invited in, and you are on their territory and their turf. They hold sonographers hold the technology and they hold the knowledge. The woman is invited in, and in that process, the pregnancy is diagnosed or confirmed, and then due dates are given. And that is regardless of a woman's experience of her body or the experience of her context. So it doesn't matter what she knows about her menstrual cycle, or when she recently had sex or didn't, or whether she feels pregnant or doesn't feel pregnant. That is all completely irrelevant until we have that scan date. And actually, we had a client last year who knew that she could only have got pregnant in a 3-day period because her husband was in the army, not in the country. And still, they changed her due dates, and she was like, "That can't be." And they were like, "Oh no, but these are your dates, right?" Because it's that authoritative knowledge. So the subtext here is about credibility and control. So what they're doing is they are observing and assessing and interpreting, and then they are passing that information down to the mother, right? She is the passive recipient of this information. And actually in some trusts, women are charged for photographs, like for the scan images as well, which are, from a commercial point of view, within the NHS, you can kind of understand that, but it's a statement of ownership, like who owns the inside and who doesn't. But her instinct and her experience have no bearing, right? So her knowledge is placed below. The next example is membrane release, like what happens when my waters go. This is another conversation I have many times with clients. What do I do when my waters go? Right, if your waters release when you are labouring during the intrapartum period, so you're having contractions and stuff's underway, everything's groovy. Everybody's very happy, that's great, have a look and see what colour it is, and on we crack. But if your water's released before you are contracting, otherwise premature release of membranes or rupture of membranes, there is a concern because your baby is no longer in a sterile environment, right? So it's right that we should be keeping an eye on potential infection risk. But what happens in that scenario is women will phone their midwives and say, "Oh, I think my waters are gone," and they will be invited to go into hospital where they will be assessed. And what that means is you have to leave your house, you have to get in the car, you have to drive to the hospital, you have to walk from your car to triage, you're then potentially sitting in triage for either 10 minutes or 2 hours waiting for a room to become available, and then you see any number of healthcare assistants, and you might have 1, 2, 3, possibly 4 people putting their hands or a speculum in your vagina to work out what's going on. Now, most women not having any confidence in their knowledge and their ability to kind of assess themselves will just comply, and they'll say, "Oh, okay then," and off they go into hospital, and that commonly ends in an induction of labour, which is, and I was talking about earlier in the cascade of care, can end in assisted births or caesareans. There are some women who feel that actually it's more of a risk to go to hospital, and it's a much better idea for them to stay at home in their environment, hunker down, dial up the oxytocin, allow the process to kick off on its own, and keep an eye on themselves. You know, how do they feel? Is my temperature up and down? And often those women who try to do that will experience, I've made a note here, these very sensible words that I use, so they feel they are bullied, coerced or scared into going into submission, basically. They're being bullied into submission. And we had a client last year, this exact situation happened with her, and the local trust tried to get her to sign a letter absolving them of responsibility if her baby died. Right, so that's really, that's a really difficult decision to make when you're labouring. That's really hard. So what's happening in these two examples here of the scans and also in the waters releases is an expression of authoritative knowledge. So it's a hierarchy of credibility and control. It's a determination of who's in charge, who makes those risk assessments and how valid they are. And once those risk assessments are made, that's also your care pathway laid out for you over the period of time that you're there. And it undermines women's bodies, as Ziggy was saying. It's making women's bodies appear to be unreliable and a risk to their baby. And the other thing it does is it positions hospitals and medics as the only option for safety, for undiminished risk. So in truth, for all the talk that we hear about women-centred care, compassionate care, informed consent, birth choices, actually women's knowledge, our intuition and our own concern for our health and the health of our babies holds little or no sway against the authoritative knowledge within the institutions of birth. And in fact, the national clinical guidelines that are in place that midwives and medics have to work within, trust policies and guidelines that they have responsibility to work with within their employment contracts, often limit and inhibit the ability of midwives and medics to put women's knowledge, values and preferences at the forefront of their care. So women are restricted by this kind of bureaucratic, institutional culture of consent and decline, because that's what it is. We're not talking about free choice, we're talking about, you've got this choice, this is it, do you consent or do you decline? So it's not free choice, it's an illusion of choice. And women either submit or they rage against the machine. And often when we are working with women who are experiencing birth trauma, that is one of the sides of their trauma, is the fact that actually it's not so much the process of their birth or what happened, but the fact that they weren't able to be heard. And COVID, no, it's perfect, COVID. Beautiful, thank you. COVID, pregnant lady. COVID really laid this bare. You know, we had a raging pandemic and everything was stripped back to its absolute essentials, quite understandably. What we identified was who was in control of that decision making and who decided what was essential and what wasn't. Because what we saw was initially a nationwide suspension of home birth services and the closure of birth centres, and the limitations of how many birth partners you can have and when you can have them. You know, we had clients within that period whose birth partners missed the birth of their child because they were outside the hospital not able to attend. And that's not over. You know, we're 18 months down. In the trust that I work within, only last week are they allowing second birth partners in. The local birth centre remains closed and has been closed since March 2020, I can't remember what it was. Thank you. So how did we get here, right? How have we got to this point, right? How did we give away our power? I'm not going to suggest that anybody who works within the NHS in maternity services is a misogynist, right? I'm not here to suggest, and I don't want to fan the flames of the birth wars. I think it's too easy to do, so I'm not here to fan the flames of the birth wars either. I don't want this to be about us and them, because that is really not a helpful narrative either. And I'm also not suggesting that women know by instinct and should lead their own care. As Ziggy was saying, there are births in which medical knowledge and intervention is really valid and necessary, and that, you know, that's important that we don't lose sight of that either. But I do think that it's important to understand how we got to this point, and I think in order to do that we have to reflect on how bodies have been conceived and understood over time, and not just bodies generally, but in particular women's bodies. So Susan Bordeaux, who you may be familiar with, described the arc of Western philosophy as a project of disembodiment, which is a phrase I absolutely love because it's a really neat encapsulation of this idea of mind-body dualism, right? Where we have an aspiration to slough off. I'm just smiling at Rose because Rose is like, yes, it's all true. Well done, thank you very much.
Charlie, could you just say that again a bit more slowly, please?
No, that's how I speak, sorry. It's Susan Bordeaux.
Yeah.
And she wrote about the arc of Western philosophy as a project of disembodiment.
Oh.
So she's talking about mind-body dualism, this aspiration to slough off our unruly animalistic meat jackets that Jane Clare Jones wrote about recently, with this aspiration to attain a cool, rational objectivity of mind. And that concept underpins the flourishing of medical science during the Enlightenment, and within that framework, I mean, I only have to say that, but within that framework we can understand how the process of birth is perceived as being sensitive, dynamic and subject to hormones, right? Like within that mind-body dualism, birth already is looking a little bit shaky. But it's more pernicious than that because that dualism becomes sexed over time. And so what happens is the mind is associated with the male, and like we don't need to know all about this theory. We recognise this in the world all around us, right? So the mind is associated with the male as measured, objective and rational, and the body is equated with female, irrational, uncontrollable, unpredictable. And women's bodies then are not even understood as a matching part to men's, as the equal and the opposite pairing, right? They're understood as an aberration. And Jean-Paul Sartre very charmingly described the obscenity of the female sex is everything which gapes open. Like the horror with which he regards us is overwhelming. So our bodies are not just understood as representing a lower order, but actually inhabiting a woman's body becomes a limiting factor in and of itself. So it represents like a failure to comply. We are a problem to be solved, as Anna described earlier on. And in 2017, Elizabeth Spellman wrote, "Women's bodies are destined to inferior status in all spheres that privilege rationality." So, I mean, that is hospitals, right? That's science. So in birth, women are kind of doubly disadvantaged because not only do we present with a normal physiological process, which is understood as pathological within science and medicine, but we present in a woman's body. So like we get that double whammy, as we're terming. And these historical and theoretical conceptions matter because they are woven into the fabric of our understanding about what women are. And they're the basis of our understanding about our reproductive bodies and birth and motherhood overall. And so as we enter matrescence, this phase, this period of pregnancy, birth and becoming a mother, because that doesn't just happen when the baby's born, right? It's a process over time. We are socialised to accept that our bodies are going to be judged and observed. We become accepting of the idea that we are not the authorities on our own bodies, and we are used to deferring to patriarchal stereotypes or archetypes. And of course there's a pincer manoeuvre at play, isn't there? Because that's not enough. On the one hand, our real functioning sex bodies are taboo. I've got a list of words here that I really like, so I'm just going to yell them at you. You know, our bodies are synonymous with a wild and unpredictable nature. They are leaky and bloody, cyclical, dynamic and capricious, right? They're fucking terrifying to medics. They're like, oh my god, what is it going to do next, right? But on the other hand, the only acceptable female body is the sexualised body, perpetually available to the male gaze, tamed, managed, plucked, preened and painted, and kept infertile. Like when we think about I'm not going to cast aspersions on everyone in the room, but you know, I was 16 when I went on the pill, and I was on the pill until I was in my late 30s, making myself infertile because God forbid what would happen if I got pregnant. The horror of motherhood, right? It's not motherhood that's intrinsically problematic, it's the framework that we do it in. Thank you. And then the next thing, because that's not all either, actually the founding idea that science is objective is also untrue, Emily Martin,
yes,
right? Yeah. Yes. So Emily Martin wrote a fantastic article in 1991, I think it was, called The Egg and the Sperm, How Science Constructed a Romance Based on Stereotypical Male-Female Roles, which I think you can describe as gendered anthropomorphizing of the sperm and the egg. So the common preconception, not only in medical literature but also in culture, is that, you know, the female is passive, kind of floating around in the fallopian tubes, not really doing anything, right? Waiting for these active, determined, valiant, masculine sperm to come and harpoon her, right? Which we know, in truth, is a bit more complicated than that. Right, but we see that idea, that lack of objectivity, not just in these preconceptions and these kind of overarching notions, but we also see them in practice. And Ziggy mentioned you nicked my story, Ziggy, but about CTG. You know, CTG, this continuous gender monitoring, is really recommended to. Just so many women who will turn up in the hospital and be recommended to be strapped up to the CTG monitor. Right, it's a very, very common thing to happen. But a 2017 Cochrane review showed that there was no clear evidence of reduction in either cerebral palsy or death correlated with CTG, but CTG is correlated with an increase in assisted birth and cesarean. Right, that is never discussed with women. When a medic comes into the room and says, we think you should run CTG, they never say, and the risk of it is this. Despite the fact that assisted births and cesareans can really have long-term effects on women's experiences of their body and their understanding of themselves. So the picture is, thank you, so the picture is really dissonant. So despite the information that we get from the NHS, from the Royal Colleges, from the NCT, from doulas, from hypnobirthers, the whole bag, and I'm including you in this, Hill, we talk about informed consent and we talk about facilitating women's active engagement in their birth plans. But the truth of it is that neither the National Clinical Guidelines nor the framework of the institutions of birth make this consistently, realistically possible. Right, medical knowledge of birth is privileged and women's knowledge and intuition is prejudiced. The practice it elicits is inconsistent between trust and practitioners, and that's another issue for pregnant women, is that, you know, they're talking to their peers and friends across the country, and one trust does one thing, one trust does another. It's really hard for them to aggregate really solid knowledge that they can feel confident in. And this narrative is often incoherent also with the stated objectives of minimising risk, right? It's coherent from a medical point of view, but from a woman's point of view, they're being told that X is risky, but actually they're going, well, actually I think assisted birth or caesarean is quite risky, and you're making those slightly strange decisions. And we also know with the evidence of our own eyes, too few women have a good enough birth, and far too many have traumatising birth experiences. And maternity is in crisis. Maternity care is in crisis. There's just no two ways about it. I mean, only this week we had a report from the East Kent Hospitals Trust, which is the area that I work in, had 2 midwives from the trust that I work directly in who went to the press to talk about their concern because they're not able to practice safely, right? We have a cohort of traumatised midwives. They are exhausted. Midwives are professionals. They are supposed to be autonomous professionals with an, you know, they go into midwifery to support birth, but actually what they're doing is they're witnessing and being asked to take part in subpar care on an industrial scale. It's hard. Midwifery attrition is at 30%, and we're witnessing a wholesale loss of those midwifery skills, which are irrecoverable. Once they're gone, they're gone. And that's because midwives are being trained at the moment to escalate risk, to identify red flags and to escalate it up right the way through to medics at the top. And it's not enough to focus on trauma, although there's plenty of trauma to be talked about. You know, there are hundreds of thousands of women who don't experience traumatic births, who just have a shitty time. Actually, it's not good enough. And Sue Down said, you know, it's not enough just to be talking about the avoidance of trauma. We need to be talking about the potential for joy. And we had a bit of a funny experience with that this morning as well, didn't we? So where do we go from here? Right, what do we do? Right. The intent is not to homogenise birth, but to re-centralise women. For too long, the narrative has been about how do we stop interventions, how do we stop caesareans. That's the wrong question, right? That's not the right way to approach it at all. We need to be thinking about how do we re-centralise women. This is not about a rejection of medical care, it's about a rejection of bureaucracy. And actually for my research over the summer, I was interviewing a number of women, and all of them said, apropos of nothing, I'm not rejecting care. I don't want to say no to medicine. I just want to be given the opportunity to do it on my own, to do it my way. There is no best way at an individual level, but we can recognise population level trends, right? We know from research by the World Health Organization and various other researchers that actually women just prefer not to be interfered with, and we should be listening to that. We should be listening to them. We need to find a way to recognise women's contextual and environmental complexities. You know, women's choices are mediated not just by their understanding, but by the reality of their worlds. You know, a primate woman, a woman who's pregnant for the first time, will have different considerations than a woman who's got 2, 3 or 4 children, and we need to be able to take that into account. We need to recognise the role of the midwife as an autonomous professional. They have expertise and judgment, and we also have to think about the value of continuity of carer. Oh my God, right, I think I'm the last woman in Britain who had proper continuity of care because I had the same 2 midwives for all 3 pregnancies and all 3 births. Right, that's unheard of now. Unheard of, and it's so important. We need to start talking about the role of intuition in birth. Right? Partographs and medical note-taking, it's really important because we need to understand how you get from one end of the birth to the other, but we also have to talk about intuition. How do we record that, and how do we give women and midwives the autonomy to work in that way? And we also need to accept that authoritative knowledge has its place. You know, like, medical care is important sometimes, but also women sometimes like to be given direction. They like to be reassured and to be told that they're doing a good job and that it's all going well. This is not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but about applying some nuance, right? Baby out with the bathwater, that's probably not the right phrase. What I want to think about is about values-based practice. You know, if we're talking about values-based practice, where we're thinking about values-based care, then that's the right way forward. And I think we ought to be thinking about whether midwifery care and whether maternity care should be in the healthcare system, or whether we should be thinking about moving it into social care, so that primarily we think about it as a social event and only move it into a healthcare issue when it becomes one. yeah, and that's it. I have a lot to say. And I'm going to grab it straight. So thank you very much for listening. Hello. Can I just say thanks to these two? It's such a privilege to follow them because they said everything. I'm not a midwife or a doula, I'm a writer, so I bow to their authoritative knowledge, and basically I have nothing else that I need to add to what they've said. But some of you know me as the author of these books, and some of you also may know me from slightly being in the news over the summer because I dared to say that obstetric violence is violence against women. So it's great to be here amongst friends anyway, what can I say? So my talk's going to spin through some of the issues around birth, women's reproductive biology, the narrative and words around women's bodies that I've observed in the past decade of talking and writing about pregnancy, birth and most recently periods. The thread that hopefully runs through will be women's knowledge and wisdom of their body and the power of words. So, next slide please. It starts with the egg. So Charlotte's touched on the egg. So how do we present facts and information? Every drawing in every biology book, however seemingly dry and boring, will tell you a story about the people at that time and how they understood women and their bodies. I knew there would be diagrams in my period. This is my book that just came out, which is for preteen girls. And I knew I didn't want them all to be disembodied. Thank you. We often see pregnant women depicted in like news articles, etc., by faceless photos of just a bum, and detract from her as a whole person. So I didn't want lots of disembodied uteruses and vulvas in my period for the same reason. We are whole people, not body parts. So one day, my then 10-year-old daughter came downstairs to find me at the kitchen table drawing. I'm not an artist, as you can see, this is mine. This is my daughter's, and not much difference between them, and haven't made much progress since I was 10. So she finally came down to find me at the kitchen table drawing a picture on the left. She was curious as to why I was doing it. So I explained about the book and the way I wanted to show that a uterus was part of a girl, not a weird floating object. So she got out a pencil and did her own version. And I can't tell you how thrilled I was when the illustrator went with my daughter's idea and it made it into the book. This is the illustration from the book. So even my daughter at the age of 10 could quickly see how humanising the illustration was important. And I only gave her a quick explanation and it was obvious to her. And eggs. I discovered another interesting narrative when writing about ovulation in the book. Who here has heard the story, which Charlotte just mentioned, that the sperm all have a race to get to the egg and the best and strongest one is the winner? You've all heard that story, right? But did you know that eggs are also competitive? Has anyone ever told you that? No? Your ovaries contain little sacs called follicles, where there are always eggs in different stages of development. And each month, some of these eggs start to get bigger and stronger, ready to be released. And the winning egg is usually the biggest and strongest and is released to travel down the fallopian tube. You could see this as a competition to see which egg will be the chosen one, just like the racing sperm. But we are not often told this story. In fact, many people have never heard of it, and I certainly hadn't until I've researched it for the book. So even in this description of the biological event of conception, there are familiar themes. The egg, mysterious and passive, waiting for something dynamic to happen to her. The sperm, heroic, strong, competitive and active, saves the day, etc. The tale is old as time. The seeds we plant. So it's very interesting to think about and explore the stories that we're told about our female bodies and think about how this impacts us. As well as stories that give us subtle messages about our role in life, like the one of the passive egg, there are many others that depict women's bodies as defective in some way or not fit for purpose. I wrote a chapter about this in my book, Give Birth Like a Feminist, which is not a birth book necessarily. It's, if you're interested in these issues that we're talking about today, that is my book about all of this stuff. And my favourite example from the book about this is that of the obstetric dilemma. Has anyone heard this story? Female childbirth is difficult, if not impossible, because we have evolved to walk on two legs. You've been told that? A lot of people get told that, you just see it as, oh, well, it's because we're not apes anymore, we walk upright, so that's why birth's really, really hard
Yeah. So what does it imply? It implies that women's bodies are not really quite right, are they? So the obstetric dilemma theory is that we have had to reach an evolutionary compromise in the pelvis, basically meaning it's just wide enough for birth, but not so wide that we cannot stand up. What a dilemma, especially if you're in obstetrics, right? Everyone accepts that the obstetric dilemma is fact, basically, but it is only a theory, put forward in 1960, and it's since been debunked by this fantastic woman called Holly Dunsworth, who's a Rhode Island anthropology professor. In 2007, she became curious about how a theory that suggested women are biologically compromised in some way could be so widely accepted. And in 2012, she put forward a new theory, which is called egg. And I can give you links to read about this. I haven't got time to go through it all with you today. But it's widely, just Google her name, Holly Dunsworth, egg, and you'll find lots of articles about it. And it focuses on one of the many unanswered questions about women's bodies: when and why does labour begin? So, this is what I'm not going to tell you all about the theory, but I'll tell you the quote she gave me for the book, for Give Birth and Feminist, because I love it. She said, "If one was so inclined, one might even say that women's hips are more adapted than men's. Given selection did not just build them as keystones of bipedalism, but also as gateways for the ever-evolving species. Nevertheless, the obstetric dilemma is subsumed into the medical tradition and is helping to overestimate risk and to underestimate women's bodies. Women are not compromised, and our bodies do not pose dilemmas to be solved. We are just as adapted as men, and all the proof you need is that we birthed all of them." If we accept the obstetric dilemma as fact, though, we come to birth, even before labour starts, with low expectations of women's capabilities. This is me in a picture, by the way. Just after I birthed my second baby, at home, no drugs, no tearing, no stitches, and she was 10 pounds 4, so there was no dilemma. My pelvis worked just fine. Next time. So, my inspiration for moving into periods, so to speak, came from a workshop I attended with an amazing Australian woman called Jane Hardwick Collins. She's on social media and she's very much worth following. I rather love her. She runs something called the Shamanic School of Womancraft out in Australia. But she came to Glastonbury, which is quite near where I live in the UK, and asked me to go on a workshop with her, which is all about menstruation. And she asked everyone in the workshop to consider some questions. I'll put them out here now for you to consider maybe later on in your own time. Questions like, how were you born? How was your mother born? What were your mother's experiences of pregnancy and birth? How was she told about menstruation or birth by her mother? How were you told about periods? How was your first period? What happened? How did you feel when you were first pregnant, etc., if you've had a baby, obviously. So I highly recommend spending some time thinking about these questions, going back through your maternal line, what some people call the red thread, of your mother and your grandmother, if you know about them, and the stories that they were told and the stories that they told you. And when I did that quite simple exercise, really, in Jane's workshop, I thought, I had one of those fantastic boom kind of, it really was quite revelatory about the sort of the narratives that get passed down through our mother line. So many of today's women don't have a positive narrative about periods, birth, or breastfeeding. And many women struggle with some or all of these aspects of being female. We need to revive the tradition of women passing on wisdom to other women somehow. And there are also serious gaps in our knowledge about our own female bodies. David Lammy doesn't know what a cervix is, or whether or not you can grow one, or have one implanted, or, as he put it, all the rest of it. But many women don't know what a cervix is either. Around 50% of women don't know what a cervix is or where it is in their body. Next slide, please. Just another interesting one that I discovered when I was writing my period. What the fuck is cervical fluid? I thought, right, okay, I need to put this in the book. I need to kind of explain it, like, what is it? Had I ever thought about this before? No. So, this is just a quick example of trying to see, so this is like a research process, good old Google. So, okay, simple question, what is cervical fluid? Okay, cervical fluid, aka mucus, got the major components, vagina, just fine. Yeah, produced by the cells of your cervix, it says. Okay, that's interesting. Right, so how do your cells make cervical fluid, you ask Google? Well, you know, your eggs start to ripen. It doesn't really tell you. It just says that the cervical glands begin to produce a sticky fluid. So, what are cervical glands, I say to Google? It tells me cervical lymph nodes are located in the sides and back of the neck. I just couldn't, you know, and I've still don't really have a proper answer to the question. I have really tried to find it out. What the fuck is it? Where is it made in the body? How? What's in it? No one seems to know. No one seems to care. Next slide. So, in the past 10 to 15 years, social media, for all its ills, has offered an opportunity for women to share and explore the biological experience of being female uncensored. Well, actually not uncensored, because as they've used social media to put their bodies in, and their real female bodies out there, Facebook and Instagram and everybody have said, no, these are some of the examples that you've seen them, your pubic hair got censored, this one, Ruby cow, period blood, that got taken down my Instagram. Next slide, please. And these are some examples of me being censored. This was a great one a few years ago. This is around 2014. And do you remember when Kim Kardashian's bum broke the internet? And it just so happened that when all that was in the news, I got kicked off Facebook for sharing a picture of a woman's bum. Not mine, not my bum, but someone's bum that they'd sent me because they just had a baby or they're in labour. So, you know, it started a really good conversation, actually. I was able to write about that and say, this one bum is okay, the other one isn't. And these are two pictures that on another occasion I got kicked off Facebook for sharing. And, you know, I wrote an article about it in The Guardian at the time. I'm not sure they let me write for them anymore, but... this is what I said, you know, birth is a fundamental feminist issue right now. It belongs to a wave of feminism that focuses on the female body. The female body in childbirth, this was in 2014, so much has changed. The female body in childbirth has been sanitised and censored in recent decades, covered by drapes, silenced by drugs, and even devoid of pubic hair. You know, they used to take women's pubes off when they were born. As a result, we have a generation of women who have rarely seen or heard the reality of birth, and who have been told that when you have your baby, you must leave your dignity at the door. Many women approach birth with fear, and perhaps worse still, often do not realise that they have the right to say no in the birth room, just as they do in the bedroom and the boardroom. In both of the banned images, it is the women who are delivering their babies. Birth is something they are actively and powerfully doing themselves. They challenge everything many people wrongly assume to be true about childbirth, and show the female body naked, shameless, real, capable, useful, active, empowered. This is why women need to see these images, and this is why they are censored. Next slide. And also, you know, the three of us, you know, over the years have experienced, you know, the language of pushback that comes, you know, to people who step forward and say, you know, we can reclaim birth, it can be a great thing for women, you know, we get all these things like a healthy baby. Don't forget, you know, healthy babies, you know, all that matters. You don't need to worry, get all these birth plans, everything, and, you know, just go with the flow. You know, birth's potluck anyways. There's no point planning it. Just don't, you know, don't take any kind of active role in this, basically. Next slide, please. And this even is, you know, not just coming from sort of, you know, the sort of doctors and midwives conversations with women, but I mean, this is a book by Adam Kay, where he, you know, he talks about, it's a million-copy bestseller, and he talks about a certain denomination of floaty-dressed mother, who he says, 2 centuries of obstetricians have found no way of predicting the course of a labour, but a certain denomination of floaty-dressed mother seems to think she can manage it easily. Yeah. And when you say on Twitter from time to time, as people do, this book is full of misogyny, people get so cross with me. He's blocked me, and loads of people think I'm wrong, but I just can't believe people can't see it. You know, and that's a really good point, this idea of the floaty dressed mother, because what he means is women like me. I was a floaty dressed mother, educated, white, middle class, privileged, I had the knowledge. I had people like Charlotte on my, I had midwives and doulas that I trusted. I had books to read. I had access to the information. I knew how to talk back when I knew that I could assert myself. And we are the ones who are the problems in to obstetricians and to the birth system, really, because we're the ones who are able to push back. But there are many other women who don't have all that privilege, who don't get mentioned by people like Edun. And these are obstetricians talking on Twitter about women, and I caught them out and screenshotted them. It's a while ago now. None of them are on Twitter anymore, so don't bother looking them up. But yeah, if the birth plan is laminated, you might as well start preparing theatre for an emergency section. That's why it's laminated. It will survive the massive obstetric hemorrhagic passages. Isn't there that joke that the length of the birth plan correlates with the length of the cesarean scar? I'll be using that one, ha ha ha. And it's just that the mocking of women that happens is so indicative. It says to me, you women, you need to carry on making birth plans because it's bothering them for some reason. Now, just to finish off, really, just the new taboos. So, just as we were sort of fighting all those battles, and thinking, oh, these battles are quite hard, God, this is really going on for a while, and then along comes this one, nothing, all of the other stuff that we've been talking about today is not resolved, but now we've got this new added dynamic and layer. Next slide, please. So, I know everyone in this room is kind of probably aware of all of this stuff, but I just brought a few examples, of what's missing. 1/3 of birthing individuals describe their birth as traumatic. Non-prostate owners, did you know a lactating chest changes temperature? Next slide, please. Vulva owners. This is just a comment I screenshotted once, which just shows the sort of, to me, it kind of somehow sums up the lunacy. Very similar to the thing I got into trouble for was saying that the slide said birthing people are seen as vessels, and I was like, no, hang on. The vessels thing is kind of to do with women, but yeah, this one's all about birthing parents, not being treated as vessels, and blah blah blah. So they're trying to talk about the patriarchal effect on women's bodies in birth, but they're taking the word woman out, and we know what happened to Ruth Bader Ginsburg's quote. And actually, this was one of mine. Somebody, and I've seen more examples of this. People using my words on social media and changing them to take out women or to add in birthing people, whatever they think should be there. And that's not on. Next slide, please. And these are some NHS ones, which, people keep telling us, people like me, no, we're just adding more words, we're just using more ink, we're not taking the word woman out, it's not, and it's just massive gaslighting, because every single day somebody sends me a new example.
Yeah.
And so here's some more of them. So next slide, please. Why does this matter? Well, the Lancet say on before, yeah. Oh no, one before. Thank you. So the Lancet kind of say why it matters. It matters because historically the anatomy and physiology of bodies with vaginas, well, we mean women, have been neglected. That taking out the word that we need to use to describe those people before we've even bothered to get a basic understanding of what their bodies are and what they do, and still we don't know what vaginal fluid is. It matters because it's just another way of sidelining us, really. Next slide. So things are shifting and changing. This one, it's really interesting to see that this pressure is not being placed on men's organisations and men's charities. The Prostate Cancer UK people very recently, said this on Twitter and didn't seem to get into much of a bother about it. Next slide. And many of you may know that BPAS have recently made a statement where they've said they're going to carry on using the word woman in their literature. If you haven't read it, it's worth reading this paragraph, because this sums up why we need to keep using the word woman, why I've used the word woman and girl in all of my books. Because you can't, how do they put it?
Continue to use the word women over people so we can continue to campaign effectively.
Yeah, I find it. Oh, thank you. We will continue to campaign effectively for reproductive rights. Women's reproductive healthcare choices remain regulated and restricted in the way they are precisely because they are women's issues. If we cannot clearly articulate that it is predominantly women rather than people at large who are affected by this, we will find it much harder to dismantle a framework that today is still underpinned by sexism. That just literally puts it so utterly beautifully. But I do know that I've seen that there's going to be some pushback and some complaining against them. And I hope they're able to stand firm, because I think words matter. I was cancelled for saying what BPAS said. I objected to a social media post that said birthing people are the fragile sex. It's not people who've been seen as the fragile sex and oppressed on that basis, it's women. I said, let's not forget who the oppressed here and why, and as most of you know, all hell broke loose. And of course, I am by no means the only woman to be attacked and have people try to destroy their career and their livelihood for stating biological reality and for naming the oppressed. So just as we were getting to the point where we're beginning to discuss our biological experiences, share them with other women, weave together some of those broken threads of wisdom, call it a vulva and learn what it is, suddenly our words are being censored and made taboo again. In Give Birth Like a Feminist, I ask if it's a coincidence that when women have a truly empowering birth experience, where they tune into the power of their bodies, where others in the room step back and allow them space, where they birth their baby in their own way, in their own time, on their own terms, is it a coincidence that those women who have this experience find it transformative, and it is almost impossible for women to access this experience? Are we holding women back from experiencing this power? That's the question I asked in Give Birth Like a Feminist. But now I ask, is it a coincidence that our words are being censored at this specific point in time? A time when we were starting to reclaim birth, reclaim female biology, talk uncensored. Now it has become a situation in which we have to think before we speak again. Choose our words carefully. Think about others, not just ourselves. Think about the impact of our words. Be kind. Respect the new cultural taboos. Censor ourselves, basically. And no, I don't think it's a coincidence. Thanks for listening.